No way, Jose.
The following footage proves beyond any doubt that the tanks intentionally set the house on fire. It proves that the Branch Davidians were murdered. You can see that this tank has a gas jet on the front that shoots fire. You can also see the fire quite plainly. The tank goes into the house twice, and each time as it backs out, the fire at the gas jet is plainly visible.
We must all do more to recognize and look for the early warning signals that deeply troubled young people send.
Hey guys, welcome to No Way Jose. Today I'm joined by Radix Verum, or Christina, depending on which one you want to go by. We're, as you can tell by the title, we'll be talking about the Kekoa Fed, is what I'm calling it. Although this is, for those who, it's a story I feel like for a lot of people kind of went under the radar a little bit. Did not get the shine it should have, which you'd think this would be an explosive story, but such is the nature of how information moves when it's important. It doesn't seem to get picked up by the big names. But I'm finally covering. It seems like this is kind of coming to a close now, and that's why it seems like a good time to cover it. Although it doesn't seem to have a happy ending for our types, but we'll get into all that. But just to give you a little quick summary, it was essentially this militia in Virginia called the Kekoas. They essentially outed what looks like a provocateur. Well, actually, not looks like, it straight up was a provocateur. And now it looks like it was some sort of Fed, but we'll get into that. But before we get further into this, I do want to let you guys know that today's episode was brought to you by our friends over at NWJ Shave Co. If you're tired of that razor burn irritation, those ingrown hairs that you can get from those multi-blade cartridges, and these are your guys. Go back to the traditional shave. You don't need expensive nonsense. You can shave just like your grandpa used to. Whether you're shaving your entire face or just edging up your beard, the single blades give you a barber-grade shave for a fraction of the price. So upgrade your shaving system. The standard issue includes one traditional safety razor and a box of 100 stainless steel razor blades. $75 allows you to shave for the entire year. It says a year. Let's be real. I mean, unless you're shaving on the regular, it's going to last you a lot longer. It definitely has for me. Now, if you're one of those people who shaves on the regular, I highly recommend the Quarter Shave Club. That'll put you at about 25 cents per replacement blade. He's also got shave lathers and soaps and stuff now. I've tried both of them. They're great. I really like the 3-in-1. It's shampoo, soap, and you shave, so you can do all that in the shower. Or it smells really good. Feels good. Great for shaving. So check that out. Go to doshaveco.com. Use Jose at checkout for 10% off. It's a COVID mandate refusing company. I always remind you guys of this. So support these guys because this company was literally born out of refusing the COVID mandate. Lost his job. Reverted to entrepreneurialism to support himself, and here we are. So support him so he can support me. It's a good product as well. I really do enjoy it. But with that, let's get back to our show. Let's bring Christina on here. Hey, Christina, how you doing? Long time no see.
Hey, thank you for having me. And shout out to that company. I love to see Patriot-owned businesses, and I think it's so important that we support them. Good on him also for standing up for what he believes in as far as the COVID vax goes.
Yeah, I actually had him on the show a while back. I don't know, maybe a few months ago. He literally got kicked out of the military for refusing it. He had a pretty good job, and he had actually a really interesting story because he was like kind of in the medical side of the military. So he
Oh,
was kind
wow.
of really into this stuff and was kind of one of the people blowing the whistle, kind of like, hey, trying to fight this on that side of things. So pretty interesting story. Highly recommend people go check it out. He has an interesting story. Good product too. So yeah, I mean, bummer it is what it is, but so
Yeah,
uh,
but good for him. I mean, who knows? Maybe this is obviously what God wills for him. And I also like that there's no plastic. I'm paranoid more and more about microplastics.
yeah,
I
wasn't that thing a while ago? Like what
everything.
something like what I don't even remember what the stat was. It was something an obscene amount of like plastic they found in men's
Yes.
balls, which was like a
Yes, and now
bizarre.
they're saying in the brain, like
Mhm.
it's literally everywhere in people's heart tissue. It's now in layers and layers of rock sediment that is so far down. It's like, oh my God. It's so polluted. It's probably irreversible damage to the environment. Now I'm going to become an environmentalist. I'm
Yeah.
going to be radicalized.
Yeah, no,
But
it's pretty cool.
it is
Yeah.
bad, but I think that there's probably ways to go about reducing like the microplastic waste and probably fixing some of the damage that has been done. It's just mostly transitioning people off of plastic and back to paper and
Yeah.
aluminum and the other alternatives.
It is hard. Plastic is convenient in so many ways. So, but I don't
I
know, maybe the
know.
future. But plastic's also pretty cheap, and I don't know, all the metal and stuff is cooler. So there we go.
True.
I think people are coming around. Well, I'm glad to have you back. You're a friend of the show. You've probably in the top 5 of people who've probably been on the show the most. So anyone's been paying attention to my channel long enough knows who you are, knows what you're about. I mean, you've been working on your documentary on the Michigan stuff. We'll probably talk about it a little bit more later. So I definitely refer people to you for your work on that. But today we're kind of talking about a similar story, although it was like
I know.
Whitmer, almost like an attempted Whitmering. Although
Yeah.
now you saw my post today, where I guess we'll get into that detail in a bit. But geez, it may connect more to modern day events, and I'll admit that's wildly
Yeah.
speculating, but it does just like all the dots line up, and you're like, whoa,
No,
whoa,
and you're not the first person who said that.
yeah,
Everybody has kind of reevaluated that one piece of information in light of everything that's happened and been like, wait a second here.
yeah.
And you're right. I mean, I think that the news happens so fast. There's always so many different news stories happening, not just here in America, but honestly around the world. Like we're constantly inundated with stuff, I feel like. So I think that sometimes stories like this, when they first happen, they fly under the radar, especially with something like ousting a member of a group, right? It's not as if there was this big law enforcement takedown and this big hoax like in the Whitmer case. This, has more the hallmarks of an attempted Whitmer fednapping, like you were saying. It seems like you know, maybe they were
Mhm.
trying.
Yeah.
And
I I will say this case is interesting in that the I've heard people say before, like kind of the hypothetical and like not even knowing of this story, like, well, what would happen if you do have a provocateur and in the act of it, you then kind of out him to the authorities or to the public? Like, what happens? Are they now legally liable? Like, because it's like, it's essentially now put them in the spot to where it's them. It just looks like they're the one doing it and they are doing criminal activities. So what happens in that case as opposed to the opposite with like a Whitmer type thing where it's basically all said and done and now they get to craft their case. So this is interesting in that regard, and I guess we get to see how that kind of plays out. But I guess I went through today. I read through all Ford Fisher's reporting on it. You and Ford have been like the two top people covering it. I don't know. I'm assuming Ken probably wrote a piece or two, maybe. But I'll
he
forgive him if he
probably
didn't.
did.
Yeah, I mean, I
I
wouldn't
think
be
he did
surprised. Yeah,
actually.
yeah,
I'm certain he did at one point.
yeah.
But really shout out to Ford Fisher who
Hmm.
broke the story. He's done excellent reporting on it, much better than mine. So I refer everybody
Hmm.
go read his stuff on it. I have covered it in my capacity as like somebody local here who's in the area. But I think definitely he's probably a little more knowledgeable than me as being the person who interviewed the Kekoas when it first happened. And I have talked to some of them since this has happened and gotten some of their reactions. But yeah, it's just one of those it's one of those stories that you look at it and you go, I can see. So like with the Whitmer case, obviously the feds used a number of informants for that, and it was sort of like a much bigger thing. They wanted that to be a multi-state plot. They had their informant talking about a big 15-state movement. You know, the FBI was putting on these FTXs. They were holding joint FTXs. So they said that National had called one of these FTXs. So they're bringing together people from different states, ostensibly different militia groups, and then trying to get as many people together as possible while the feds are all recording. Now, with this case, it seems probably because the Virginia militia scene is not as big as the Michigan militia scene. For people who aren't familiar, Michigan has a very long history of having militia groups. It's more out in the country and stuff, and I think that's more part of its history. So there's lots of militia groups in Michigan and Virginia. There are some, but probably not as much. And so I think it's probably just a smaller group in general. It seems like maybe they didn't need, you know, as many provocateurs, or who knows, maybe they would introduce more eventually, but you know, they got caught out. And it's so fascinating because with the Whitmer thing, you have these number of informants, and yes, they are they're being suspicious, but it's also one of those things that if you're not part of that community, maybe you're not aware of how these people talk, but sometimes you just have people who like to talk. They like to rant. People like Barry Croft, who are ultimately harmless, but when you put them in a group of men, you know, they're trying to act tough with each other. So you've got people like that, and you never know who you're going to be dealing with. And then you have more paranoid people. So this guy, Vane, Duke was his call sign. His real name is Russell Richardson Vane IV. He joins this Virginia militia in, I believe it's April of 2022. He joins the group, and very, very early into his joining this group, he starts bringing things up to them about, oh, hey, you know, do we have any funds set up for polling money? And so he's suggesting kind of crowdsourcing money, and they are telling him, oh no, you know, we pay our own way. That's just how we do it. And he starts, so it starts with something like that. That is just early into his joining this group. Then after that, he's talking about starting his own chapter in Northern Virginia, which is fascinating. He actually, this guy Duke, he lives in my town. He lives in my town. So that's interesting. We're in the same place. So he wanted to have his own chapter of the Virginia Kekoas, like a Northern Virginia chapter that he wanted to lead, and I guess ostensibly like recruit his own people into. This was, of course, suspicious to them because, you know, he just joined this group. He doesn't know anything about them. Why would he want to have his own chapter? Like, when you've barely gotten to know us, you know, why would you want to represent us? Like, that's one thing that doesn't make sense. So it's just things like that. He would do, I think shortly after that, there was a protest that they went to. Another group showed up and was holding the protest. And this is, I think, at a school, if I understand correctly, or it may have been on school property. But in any case, he goes and does this weird position where he gets on the ground and he has his gun out and he like points it towards where...
I believe he was prone, for those who know gun terms, if I remember correctly. Yeah, which is just laying down, but it's
and he's like looking, pointing his gun at cars where cars are driving by. So it's just like nobody else did that day. It was kind of like a provocative thing, very strange, but nothing too suspicious. At some point, he mentions like he wants to bring a friend to training. And this person is somebody who's like of a questionable legal status. And there's some weird, I don't remember all of the details about this individual, but he's talking about him and he says something about him working for the World Bank.
And it's Pepe Montoya, I believe, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
which I guess later in this narrative it'll make more sense why that's funny, but yeah.
It's
Yeah.
so goofy. Yeah. So he's like bringing this guy in, and or he wants to bring this guy in. So again, this is something that they're kind of like, well, I don't know if we should be having somebody here whose ability to handle firearms is questionable. So
Yeah, he
that's,
was a foreigner, I believe, if I recall
yes,
correctly. Yeah, so that was the thing that
correct.
they don't know the legality of having some out of state guy or out of country guy doing such things.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Who may not be allowed to carry firearms, who could be,
Hmm.
who knows. But that's just one weird thing. And then he had some explanation for that. And then he starts, I think at this point he's still in there. So they have the militia groups have like these group chats online. They congregate online. They'll have social media pages, right? Where this is where people can learn about their group. A lot of times people join these pages to follow them and to reach out about recruitment. I think he actually initially reached out to the Kekoas online through their Twitter, I think. But in any
Yes,
case,
yeah.
he's in this they have him in like a vetting chat. After he's been in like this vetting chat for a while, he gets moved over into the other chat. And so he's in another chat, and then he starts talking about HMEs, which is an acronym for homemade explosives. And he says, oh, is this too spicy to talk about this? And he's using the like boom emojis,
Hmm.
so I look at that and I just start thinking immediately about the Whitmer stuff, and I'm thinking of like the group chats I've seen with
Red.
informants and right, and
Hmm.
the same type of thing. So that's bizarre. Then he's telling people they need to start gathering
Hydrogen
large
peroxide, I
amounts,
believe.
yeah, of peroxide, and they're like, okay, what would we need that for? And mind you, these groups are um they're militia groups, but they're also, a lot of them, they have like a prepping component to them. So a lot of their training, for example, they're training for different scenarios that could happen. They're training for what do you do like if there's if China invades, or if Russia invades, if
Hmm.
they're training for all kinds of scenarios. And they tend to be of the mindset of like prepping, being prepared for anything. None of this is illegal, mind you, but they're the kind of people who might, if somebody's telling them, hey, we should make sure that we've got like a large amounts of peroxide on us. And then when people were suspicious about that, he said something about having a certain percentage of it, which raised red flags. And then when it did, he of course had an explanation for it that would be legal, right? Like he follows it up when he's pressed, only when he's pressed about, oh well, here are legal applications for it. And so I thought that was very interesting. And then um I don't have the whole timeline memorized, so
It's
I
a
may
lot.
be going forward or backward in time. There's a lot,
Yeah,
but
I went
it's
through it all today. It took me a long time.
and it's difficult because what they do, and they did this in the Whitmer case too, is they compartmentalize, right? So you have the informant, like in the Whitmer case, you'd have the informant, Dan. He's talking to Adam Fox. Adam is the homeless man living in the basement of the vac shack. He wants to bring Adam Fox into the Wolverine Watchmen, which is Joe Morrison's group. Joe Morrison doesn't really know Adam. So Dan is saying to Adam, Joe wants you to come for training. Well, Adam doesn't know Joe. He's like, oh, okay. And then he's telling Joe, Adam wants to come to training. So there's this separation and compartmentalization. And then one person, he's telling one person one thing, telling somebody else something completely different. And, it's so you're following these weird, like different conversations the informants are having with different people at different time. And one person may not know that this person has said this to me privately. So it may be difficult for people to all pick up on the suspicious behavior, right? And the other thing about these groups is these group chats, you're not always paying attention to things that are happening. They have some of these chats, they've got multiple channels, they've got meme channels, they have all different medical, whatever. So you're not paying attention to everything that's being said at every moment in time. And of course, when you do pick up your phone, you probably just pick up and you look at like what's being said now from here on down. You might scroll up and read a few, but you're not going to scroll back and read like what was said, 2 days ago or whatever, like when you were busy. It's just not possible. So they silo and separate information. So, they're out at a training event, and Ice is I believe the leader of the Kekoas. He at one point has a private conversation with Duke. He took him out. They took their phones off. He brings up, I think this was about him talking about explosives. He was getting the talking to of like, we don't want to have that kind of talk here. And so this is the moment that he decides to talk about what might do we have a plan for what might happen if there's a presidential assassination, and mentions having a contact at the Russian embassy. And he was saying that, we could unify all of the Virginia militias under Russia for $50K a month.
Yeah. Which will, once again, that did tie into the thing I was talking about earlier, which we'll get into in a second. Any second now, I think it enters in the narrative. For some reason, I thought that might have been Preacher he was talking to, but you might be right. You probably have a better grasp.
I'm confusing two separate conversations. Yeah. You're right. He had said the one thing about I believe the presidential assassination to Preacher, and maybe said the other thing to Ice. There were two conversations, but that's the other thing, is that one person's having a conversation with him. They don't know he's talking to this other person, and he said this. And then Sasquatch is another member of the Kekoas. He gives that individual a manila envelope, and it says, I forget what he put on the front of it, but it was like highs only or something dorky,
it's like for
that.
Official use only.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
And then he doesn't look at this right away. I know at one point he's asked them, so we should back up and talk about Duke's background, because that factors into this. When Duke joined the Kekoas, and mind you, this is a Virginia militia, so just saying that it wouldn't be outside the norm of somebody who maybe works with law enforcement or something to join a militia group, right? Well,
it's also very close to DC.
Exactly. It's very close to DC. There's a lot of, not just glowies here, but there's also a lot of government contractors. There's a lot of, we've got Booz Allen Hamilton. We have the Miter Corp, however you want to say it. There's a bunch of these, what are essentially like spook cutouts, I guess. They're
the first
private
one of
companies,
which he was employed by it, but for some time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so he gives him this envelope, and inside this envelope are there's several things. One of which is a manual that is it says unclassified on it, but it's clearly, you can see government documents for making homemade explosives. And those documents, I believe, say DIA on them. Then he also provided these maps, and the maps have the NGA logo on them, National Geospatial Agency logo on them. And so all of this stuff is put together in this envelope. This is given to Sasquatch by Duke. He didn't look at what was in it right away when he gave it to him. He waited until like the next day, looked at it, and was like, oh, this is really weird. And
real quick, I guess both of us forgot to mention this, but when he joined, he was upfront and told them that he was in the CIA. So yeah, that was like, so they knew from the jump. Although that's kind of part of the thing with that agency, is that's not CIA. So it's like, who the fuck are you working for? You said you work for CIA. So But, I mean, and we don't have any proof he worked for CIA or anything. But,
no.
I mean, as you mentioned, the Booz Allen Hamilton, he did work for him for a while. So, and there's a few other that we'll get into. If you recall, there's too many to remember, to be honest.
Oh, yeah. Oh my God, this guy. No, but you're right. He initially represented himself as being an analyst with a CIA I think he said he was like a defense analyst or something. That's basically how he described himself to Sasquatch. So they thought, or they suspected he was like CIA, and they initially, people might be saying, well, why would you want a glowy in your militia or whatever? Like I said, for Virginia, you have to understand, in Virginia, you have a lot of government employees here, and not everybody is liberal. There's a lot of them here, but there's also some people who just are very pro 2A or whatever. So it's not like completely crazy that somebody might join for legitimate reasons a militia group that, maybe works for law enforcement in some capacity or a government agency, but it should have been viewed as suspicious. But they may have been thinking too, and this is also possible. You never know with some of these militia guys. Sometimes they like to talk themselves up, and maybe he just was telling that, like, in their minds, they may not even believe he's really CIA, but they said, well, if he is, if something happens, we'll hear about it first. It's good to have him around. And I think the other thing in their minds is that they were probably thinking, well, as long as we're not doing anything wrong, we don't have anything to worry about or whatever, which is like with so many people.
Famous last words.
Yeah, it's so funny because in the documentary, you guys are going to listen to the Whitmer victims, and you're going to hear from them how they feel about things now. But yeah, so he's got like this very crazy background. He gives this stuff to Sasquatch, and then he's had these other conversations. So it gets to a point where they decide that once he's talking about HMEs and stuff, they've got to get rid of him and remove him from the group, because he's posting in a chat now that isn't just associated with them. I believe they had other militia groups that were part of the chat. So if he's posting about something like HMEs in the chat, this could implicate other people. It could get other militia groups in trouble, and it could also kind of ruin the relationship that Kekoa has with these other groups that they do training with. And so from there, the story gets even weirder, because they come forward and they contacted law enforcement about him.
Real quick, I don't want to cut you off, but I wanted to back up a little bit because we didn't mention the big thing that at one point, I don't know which member, it was either Ice Preacher or Sasquatch. I kind of mix them all up. He did mention that the assassination thing.
No, I did bring that up.
Yeah. Oh, did you?
I did, but briefly.
Okay. All right, I must have missed
I
it.
confused the conversation. Okay. He brought up presidential assassination.
Okay.
And also around the same time, he had another conversation about uniting the Virginia militias under Russia for $50K a month, and said he had this contact in the embassy. So that was around the same time as the presidential assassination comment, which is, it's all very weird. Like, so he's saying this, he's giving one person potentially incriminating documents that they couldn't have, and this map, and then he's telling people to start stockpiling chemicals that could be used to make homemade explosives, which he's talking about in the chat. He seems like he's like feeling different people out too, like in these conversations of like just kind of throwing things out there and then seeing what response he gets. And his father is even more interesting. So Duke himself, he's a veteran, so he's in the military. He's worked for Booz Allen Hamilton. As you said, he's worked for other government contractors. We currently do not know which federal agency he's employed by today. They won't tell us.
Which they said he was. They said he was, so he was employed by somebody.
Yes. Yeah. So we know he's employed by a federal agency, which in court documents, all they say is a government agency.
Yes, a government agency that had access to the documents that he gave Sasquatch, which contained, I believe, information about making bombs. And then I guess we'll get into this later. Also, he admitted later that that's where he got the instructions on how to make ricin, which that'll come in later. But yeah, it's weird. And then on his dad, real quick, I believe his dad, like, he worked with his dad for a while. That's confirmed.
Yep.
At the same company his dad did, and his dad is honestly kind of almost more interesting than him in some ways. I don't really know how to explain it. I would recommend people
It's
go look through
hard.
Ford Fisher's work. But essentially, it sounds like that his dad was pretty renowned in the Intel world, and almost like in a high level, almost like a war games planning. I don't mean
Yes.
literal war, but like high level strategy planning Fed stuff. Essentially, is
Yeah,
what
and
he
Duke was
doing.
doing that stuff too. He was doing the video game stuff with his dad. We found that his video game profile. His father was doing stochastic games, they call it. So running like simulations, war game simulations. He's got publications on counterterrorism dating back to the 1990s. He's got papers on AI, which is super bizarre. I don't know if you're familiar with like you know how Chat GPT, their newest version, is coming out with these, what I think they call them autonomous agents.
I don't know much about.
Have you heard of that? So it's like it basically you can program it. It's like a Chat GPT that is like a personality. Basically, you can program, so you can kind of make it like a version of yourself and to do things or whatever. It's like you make an autonomous agent that does things essentially. So it can make more autonomous agents. That's the really creepy thing about it, is it can like replicate. It's just a really weird concept.
Kids.
I'm not, by any means an expert on artificial intelligence or like technology or anything like that, but from my very basic understanding of what it is, that's what it is. And so he was writing about that in like the 90s and 2000s.
Yeah. One more thing I did want to mention, his one point that I thought was interesting is, I don't know if it was it was some federal agencies. I don't know if it was Intel or what, but his dad, his mom, his wife, and his ex-wife all worked for something along those lines. So it's like spooked up to the gills.
Yeah, his dad, we've got one profile of him where he says he works for DHS. And again, he's got these these counter-terror publications where he's obviously been writing about terrorism. He's been writing about wargaming scenarios, things like this. Very bizarre, like you said, high-level strategy type things. And it seems like Duke was kind of following in the same footsteps. So to me, it's very bizarre how Duke ends up in this militia group doing and saying the things he does, right? Because if you're looking at this from an outside perspective of somebody who doesn't really know anything about the intelligence community and the kinds of things that they do, you look at him and who he comes from, his parents, and where he's worked, and you go, okay, so he joined this group who he is exactly the kind of group that his father has written about, that he himself has written about. And he seems to have, I don't know, have you read his like manifesto?
No, I didn't read the manifesto. No.
Okay, so he seems to have this like sort of delusions of grandeur, in my opinion, but also he like really is he likes fantasy, it seems like, and he kind of likes imagining fantastical scenarios, I guess. He had these really weird documents at his house. He's a very strange character. But you look at somebody like him and you say, well, we can't say for sure that whatever government agency he was working for directed him to go do all these things that he did, up to and including the manufacturing of ricin in his house. And so, you can't say that for sure, but look at what's happened. If this was anybody else that wasn't working for the feds, who was saying the things that he was saying, talking about HMEs in the chat, giving somebody the documents he gave them, which, by the way, he also admitted that he printed out from his work computer and then gave to somebody else, presumably, trying to get them to make the explosives. I don't know why you would be giving somebody directions to make them if you're not intending for them to do something with it, right? So it's just like, okay, if you're not working for the feds, you just decided to join a group and then go do all of these different things, and this is supposed to be, oh, okay, a coincidence or something, or then the other side of it is we're supposed to believe he could just be a crazy person. I don't believe that at all.
I do want to back up and get a little bit speculative for a moment. We mentioned the Russia thing, we mentioned the assassination thing, and obviously this is all in the context of a militia. Now let's, the hindsight, we just recently had a pretty prominent presidential election. I believe it was your husband who pointed out something along the lines of asking the specifics on whether it was a president or the president, and they definitely said a. So it's like, Trump was a president.
He
so,
was, exactly.
Yeah. So now if you
and he
just
could be one again. So
Yep, exactly. Now if you just game this out, like I don't know about you, but I know I did immediately when I saw that happening. I mean, don't get me wrong, I ran multiple different scenarios of what could have happened when all this, what could have been meant to happen or did happen when all this went down. But assuming this was legit, this was an actual assassination attempt and it failed, now we have to assume that what was the plan if it went down. And what I'm implying is me and you probably both on the same wavelength. My immediate thought was, oh, there was likely going to be some sort of right-wing oh, look at this criminal activity going on. Oh, now we got to stamp down on this because, this violent act. Because that would just kind of be the logical thing to be the fallout in a right-wing president being taken out type deal. So that, exactly. Here we are. And, obviously the Russia thing, this kind of has all the hallmarks of like, this would make sense. Like
they've been building this narrative for so long. They've been building the narrative about dangerous militia groups, right-wing extremists. They've been building the narrative about how, they're radicalizing. They want to storm state capitals, insurrection, yada, 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 white supremacy. And they've also been building the narrative that there is a global nexus, right? So they've talked about, and I'm sure your listeners are familiar with this, they have said, Christopher Wray himself has said that the greatest threat America faces is white supremacy. And so they're trying to convince people, number one, that white supremacy is the greatest threat Americans face, and this widespread domestic issue, right? And then they want to say, and there's an international nexus with Russia and Ukraine and these white supremacist groups like RAM, like Azov Battalion, who are recruiting people in America, white supremacists, training them in foreign countries, sending them back to the United States to maybe recruit and train others and build their networks underground. That's the narrative they want to go with. So could you imagine if something like this happened and then they said, and the person who did this is tied to this Virginia militia?
Yeah, and I did find it interesting, the Russia thing as well, especially the time that it happened. Like, you remember, I'm sure, shortly after the Trump's assassination attempt, we had that piece of info that came out that said, Iran was trying to do some shit. Which, yes. I mean, you got to think, when all this stuff went down with Duke and stuff, this was a little bit earlier, and so I feel like Russia was more the focus. So I guess it makes sense if you're looking at it that way. And then now it's like, now the big bad's Iran. So like, and whatever, things didn't work out like we wanted to. So look, Iran was talking about doing some assassination stuff. Obviously, They never said it was directly linked, but the just saying it in general, not providing any sort of real proof, kind of implies that they're trying to create that association in your head. So at least for me, because I don't trust anything they say. So I do find that interesting that obviously then they went with Russia back then, or he was trying to move that Russia piece, saying, hey, we can get $50K a month from Russia to support our militia or whatever, which is pretty wild, which we did then later deny when brought up by someone else. Because to be fair, because that was I believe the Russia thing was a private conversation between either him and ICE or him and Preacher. I can't remember which. So then later when someone else brought it up to him, I believe it might have been ICE, he just then kind of was like, no, that didn't happen kind of deal. So he kind of like gaslit him. So, I mean, to be fair, I guess that's, either ICE or Preacher's word against Dukes at that point. Although, let's
Correct.
be real, I don't trust Dukes.
Although, and there is more information that has come out. One of the most recent things that came out before his plea hearing was the stuff that they found at his house. So after they contacted law enforcement about him, and I think that what's interesting too is that they went to the media. Like, they went to Ford Fisher, who went public with this stuff right away, and he has a pretty big platform. So I think I don't think they expected that their guy, like their Fed, was going to be exposed and so quickly, because he'd done some provocative things, but he certainly didn't say like let's go fire rounds into the governor's mansion or something. He wasn't suggesting stuff like that yet. I mean, he did talk about a presidential assassination, but he brought it up more of like, what, do we have a plan for this? Like, he wasn't necessarily bringing it up to say, let's make this happen, but just seeding it, right? Just putting the thought out there, seeing how people respond. He hadn't gone full like Steve Robeson yet, of being very obviously glowing glowing. And so I don't think that he expected to be outed in the way that he did. And to be outed like publicly like that, I think at most, maybe they expected he'd get kicked out of the group and then he'd just join another group. I don't think that they expected, because this hasn't really happened before. This is the first time since the Whitmer stuff went down where a militia group has actually come forward and said, hey, we had somebody in our group who was acting questionable. Maybe they're a Fed, maybe they're not. We don't know, but we want other people to be aware of this individual and what they were saying, so that if this person joins your group next, you know why they were kicked out of ours and you have a heads up. And so to me, I think that is it's good news, though. It's like, wow, at least the Whitmer case, at least some good has come from that, in that it has given people the mindset of being like way more vigilant for these kinds of infiltrators, because they're doing this a lot. 12 informants for the Whitmer case it's a lot. I know you guys have seen from my trailer, there's that one quote about how that is like how many they use for a narcotics investigation that stretches from California to New York, like a big multi-state thing, to use that to go after this one small group of people who are out in Jackson County, Michigan, out in the middle of nowhere in the country, rolling around in their backyard. That's crazy. And so I think that suggests how focused they are on creating this, manufacturing this threat, that we need to be scared of these kinds of people, which also makes Duke's arrest even more fascinating, is the lack of media coverage to it. Because think about this. They arrest this guy, right? And they go to his house. The FBI has been made aware of the documents that he gave Sasquatch talking about explosives and stuff. So they search his home, and in his home, they find this makeshift lab in his laundry room where he was extracting ricin from castor beans. And this is where, by the way, he's got 2 small children at his house. His wife is also, from what I understand, partially disabled. So, you've got a disabled wife who has 2 young children in the house, and you have unsecured firearms, I believe I read as well. And you have this makeshift lab where you are extracting ricin from castor beans, which is a process. He also had to buy the equipment to test it. And I want to know, where is the ricin he actually manufactured? Because they never recovered it. They recovered the equipment he used. They have the test tubes and stuff, and they were able to test it and get the trace amounts. But they know he manufactured a certain amount of ricin, and no one knows where it is, from what I understand. And so after that, he is allowed to get this sweetheart deal. And there's no media coverage on this case. One journalist, one mainstream reporter, I think her name is Hannah from the Washington Post, is the only person that I know in the mainstream press who has reported on this. And you would think that they go, oh, a right-wing militia person who was manufacturing ricin in his house where there was kids, you'd think that that'd be a huge story that they would want to run with. Why haven't they?
Yeah. I think if I recall correctly, to be fair, I didn't read that piece, but I did see a tweet on Ford's, I don't know if it was a thread or a separate tweet in somewhere else, where I believe he referred to, like, yes, they did confirm a lot of the important stuff he brought up, but they did kind of seem to skirt away from some things. So it's like, because it's like, if you are the establishment media, like, how do you handle something like this?
Talking about his who he works for, that he works for a government agency, not highlighting that fact, not focusing on it, not saying, hey, this is a little weird, this behavior, the fact that he works for a government agency, the fact that his whole family seems to work for the feds, like maybe there's something more to this story. They don't seem curious at all. And the downplaying of things, I feel like that's, attending his plea hearing, the prosecutors didn't even seem interested in like fighting to, for anything. And granted, he's not been sentenced yet. His sentencing is going to be November 13th. So we still have some time, but I was shocked that they allowed him out. I was shocked, but I wasn't. Of course they would. He's their guy, And again, this is speculation.
There have been multiple attempts prior, and you've been following the court side of things, pretty well. So I'm sure you're aware of this. I just know from the thread that it seems like there were multiple times they tried to get him to get released, and it was only recently that they went for it. They definitely were not going for it for reasons that I guess we didn't really quite mention yet. It seemed to be the key point that why it sounds like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just kind of inferring this from the reading. One point why they brought up is they were kind of bringing up that he might be a flight risk because he essentially tried to fake his death, and not very well.
We also forgot to bring that up. That was such a comical side part of this. After he got outed, he literally tried
the day of.
He put up a fake obituary. Imagine writing your own obituary too, and like the mindset that this takes. And it actually. It looked like he had maybe been planning that though for a while. He did it that day, but it's how do you just do that? And it's strange because that I think that it's been taken down, the obituary, but the archive is still up. Read it. He talked about too that he tried to say he had some kind of brain condition or something. Do you remember?
Yeah, that was made him have struggle with grasping reality or something like that, which is like, oh, that's a perfect out if they go into this, I guess.
It was like if you were writing a script for a movie and you're like, oh, well, how do we explain away like these my manifesto that I wrote and all this other stuff. Oh, we'll just say he was suffering from a mental condition.
Yeah. Got kicked in the head by a horse or some shit. I don't know.
So that was part of like him literally faking his death or trying to fake his death. And that was actually that may have been before they actually arrested him, but he had already been outed by Ford Fisher, and he'd already been outed to law enforcement by the militia group as potentially being somebody who was involved in shady things.
Now, I said the day of, and now I don't recall if when I say day of, if I mean the day of that he got kicked out of the militia or the day of that Ford made his reporting. I'm not sure which it is. But either way, very much a suspicious day. Then, also just kind of shows very sloppy because it's like anyone looks at the date, it'd be like literally the day of.
It was the stupidest, the goofiest thing that he could have done was that, and he did it, which also, again, if this is somebody who wasn't working for the feds, maybe he just wanted to fit in and he made a bunch of stuff up. Come on, to go to these lengths, that doesn't sound right. And again, why was he manufacturing ricin at his house? Hello, that's real.
Yeah, and how we know how we know that he didn't actually, for one, obviously we know because he ended up having legal issues, but before that, like when this was initially reported, this was before he'd been arrested, how we knew that he actually didn't die is a couple weeks later, he changed his Facebook profile pic. So like it's
Not
just funny
that, but didn't his mom comment on one of it? Like,
Yeah.
like he didn't let his family in on like the fact
Yeah.
that he just recently passed away. Like you're supposed
Yep.
to be mourning.
And then he tried to change his name to his wife's maiden name, which is
Oh
like
yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
yeah, which is I don't know. It's just
That's
it's just
also
funny because it is
comical.
ridiculous and sloppy and like I don't know. If you're gonna fake your death, you'd think you'd do a little bit better than that. I mean, I will say I didn't even know you could write your own obit, so I don't know how he went about doing that. That's okay,
Well,
impressive
these
there, I
are
guess.
exactly. That's the thing that makes me think he had help, though, because it seems like they're helping him. Even now, they're helping him. This is the same thing like they did with Steve Robeson, where the FBI, in the Whitmer case, Robeson, for people who don't know, he was one of the key architects of the hoax. He is the child sex offender informant who was representing himself as a national leader. After they rounded everybody up and arrested them, they decided to burn Robeson as a source because he'd engaged in so much illegal activity. He very clearly entrapped these people, and they wanted to keep that information from coming out. They didn't want him to testify. And so they arrested him for something like basically for doing something that he had been given essentially FBI permission to do, right? Because they were aware of everything he was doing. They knew he was running around with guns and drugs across state lines as a multi-time felon. The FBI gave him they call it OIA, otherwise illegal activity. It's permission to break the law. So the FBI can give you permission to break the law. But in any case, they burn him and they say, oh, he was a double agent. And actually, he was trying to help the defendants and he wanted to destroy evidence. You know, they claimed that he called Dan Chappell, the other informant, and told him to throw Barry's gun in a lake or something. Right. Mm-hmm. The gun that the FBI like planted back on Barry after he gave it to them at Wisconsin, at Cambria, which is also another interesting thing, them planting evidence on people and then using it later. But in any case, after they burn him and they claim he's a double agent, they're still protecting him. He's got multiple felonies. So he faces a charge for theft. This is felony theft because he defrauded a couple out of their vehicle and said he was using it for his charity, this fake charity he created, Race to Unite Races. So he was looking at 3.5 years on that. Then he had the 50 cal gun charge, again, as a felon. That's years in prison. You're looking at years in prison if you get caught doing these things. The FBI had him sign an NDA in December of 2020. This is 2 months after everybody was arrested. They have him sign the NDA. Then they say, oh, actually, he was a double agent. He's not our guy. We don't condone what he was doing. We didn't know. BS, you're still protecting him. You know what he got for the 50 cal gun and the separate felony theft charge? How many days in jail as a multi-time felon?
Probably nothing, or very little, I'd assume.
0.
Yep.
He got nothing. He didn't even have to pay the fine on one of them that he was going to have to pay. He just had to pay the $500 court fee, and his wife's charges were dropped, her felony charges. So the FBI is still protecting him after saying, oh, you know, he was a double agent and he tried to help the defendants, you know, and we disavow him. BS. I think the same thing could be said about what they're doing with Vane, which is that they probably tell these people you're going to be what is essentially sheep dipped, right? You're going to be going into you're going to be infiltrating this group and you're doing so on our behalf. But if you get caught, basically, we're disavowing you, and we're not going to have anything to do with it. We'll still protect you as much as we can. But it seems like that's what's happening with Duke. So one of the items that they found at his house, and I know you've seen the list, he had a list of these various to-do lists. Some of the items on that were very innocuous, But of course, one of the items at the top of the list was White House. So he apparently had some type of plan to visit the White House. And it just makes you wonder, like, well, was he going to bring the ricin? Was this, it's like, okay, why did he need to go to the White House? What's that about? Or was he meeting with somebody at the White House? I don't know. It's just on this list that was found at his house. So I just find this whole thing strange that the day of his plea hearing, like you said, they didn't want to do a deal with him, but something happened. Something was done behind the scenes. Of course, he had his private lawyer there, also very interesting. And while we were in the middle of his plea hearing, what's his name? Judge Tranga, he had a closed set. So he had a sealed part of the hearing where everybody had to leave. We all were instructed to leave the courtroom, come out and sit in the lobby and wait while they had this sealed session. Presumably it was at this time where they discussed his employer, what agency he works for. I don't know. Again, we don't know because we had to leave. But then we came back in, and it was so interesting how they had this little conversation of like, oh, this is now over with, basically. Like, oh, let's talk about, not only are we going to let him out on bond and relinquish him into his wife's custody after we ourselves, the government, said that his wife was a negligent mother because she allowed her children to be around unsecured firearms while her husband is manufacturing ricin in the laundry room. Oh, so now we're going to release him into her custody. So she couldn't protect these infants, but now she's going to look after Duke, and she's going to make sure he doesn't violate any of the terms of his house confinement. And also interesting, towards the end of the plea hearing, while they were discussing the conditions of his home confinement, he already has a job offer, they said. So I guess they claim that he somehow was fired from this job. I mean, that's not really said. Nobody says at any point in the documents that he lost his job, but his lawyer announced that he has a job offer and wanted to discuss him potentially being allowed to travel to and from work. So, the whole thing just seems like a joke. Like, It's just being swept under the rug. They're like, okay, well, we did something. We tried, and I guarantee at his sentencing hearing, which is going to be, I'll be there, I'll be attending. I guarantee he's going to get something silly like 6 months probation and, community service or something to that effect.
Yeah, that was my guess. That he'd probably get. My guess is, I just assumed, since he's facing a max of 5 years under his current charge, I assumed he'd probably get something like 2 years with maybe 6 months actually served. Probably use time, what is it? What do they call it? Where the time he's already been sitting in jail is used. Yeah. So it'll be, or probation or something. So it'll be like a small slap on the wrist. Whereas initially he was facing life plus time.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. They really reduced his charges. They ended up giving him, out of all the charges he was facing, the least one, which was, it was something like unauthorized possession of an restricted chemical, unauthorized possession of a restricted chemical. It was like the smallest charge of all the ones he was facing. That's the one they give him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just for not registering it or something.
Yeah, like he should have registered the toxin before presumably sending it out to people, or doing who knows what he was going to do with it. I don't know, maybe visit the White House.
I will say it's a little weird. I found it odd that, for one, that the only thing he's even really looking at is the ricin thing. So, I don't know, the schizo part of me almost kind of wonders, like, was that just, like, planted as, like, a side? Because if you are... Like, let's say that obviously all this stuff did happen, and then, like, let's say he's completely spooked up. You put some ricin in there, and that way you have a charge, and it kind of is, you can kind of easily divert attention from the other stuff and be like, oh, there's some weird right-wing militia guy with ricin, and it's just that, you know?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
it was, and it's the smallest amount of and it's not
Yeah.
even, like I said, they couldn't find the rice, and they claimed that he produced and manufactured, which I think they said was 12.6 grams. So it was quite the amount. They couldn't find it. So, oh, he just had castor beans and it's the smallest amount, and then he extracted the ricin. Well, we don't know how much he made. I mean, we could. So then they act like, well, because the evidence is so weak, we just got to do this case because we didn't get all 12 grams, and we can't show he intended to distribute it or something of this nature. That's the legal argument that they would make, and of why they would explain away essentially nothing happening to him, and him really just it's been maybe a month or two in jail. He's been in jail for like 3 months, and that's it. And now he's out. He's at home right now in my town.
Yeah, I did want to real quick mention. I just recalled this, and I kind of alluded to earlier that we would mention this again because we mentioned the Pepe Montoya thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now that ties into the death, the faking the death, because on the obituary, it's an online obituary. If we didn't make that clear, I'm not sure if we did or not. There was one lone comment from a Pepe Montoya of something like, "Oh no, that's so sad," or something along those lines.
Yeah, like I just talked to him.
Yeah, and the Pepe was the name of the foreigner. I don't remember if the Montoya was his name too, but the guy's name was Pepe at the very least, at least the first name. So and then on top of that, Ford actually got in touch with the Pepe guy, and he talked to him, and the Pepe was like, "No, he's fine. I've
been talking to him. He's all right."
Yeah, so it's just like you'd think the left hand would talk to the right hand, but I guess not. Yeah, so that I'm just bringing that up. That's a sidebar, not related, but yeah. I did find it weird that they really throw the book at you for ricin. I did not realize. I mean, don't get me wrong. I assumed that'd be a serious charge, but life plus time. I mean, I guess they stack charges, so it's like multiple charges, or kind of in a certain sense, really all for the kind of the same thing. But either way, it is kind of crazy that he's only going to get less than 5 years for that. I mean, I guess to be fair, I mean, technically, you didn't really do anything else illegal. I guess the thing he gave Sasquatch is debatably illegal or not. I'm not sure. That kind of gets in the weeds of how classified information was around, because it wasn't even classified, from my recollection. But it was
marked unclassified. It was one of those things that I think they were thinking of. Jack Teixeira, the army guy who put like very similar looking maps on a Discord server. And I think the maps are really what like made them go, oh shit.
Yeah, but it did say for official use only. And I do recall from my time in the military, because I never handled any classified material or anything, but we would say, for example, I worked on planes and I was a mechanic. All of our TOs was what they're called, technical orders. And essentially all they are is for every individual job, like changing a tire, it'll have like a step-by-step, like how to do it. So, so it's idiot proof. And those are all would have like, say I printed it off or something for use for something else, it would say for official use only, because you can't just go give those to anyone. Even though they aren't classified, it's still not something you can just give out to anyone. So, I mean, this kind of gets in the weeds of how classification works. Just because something's not top secret doesn't mean you can just share it with anyone. So even though something like that, all it teaches you how to do is change a tire on a KC-135, but like, you still can't just go give that over to, Bobby down the street. Like, not that you'd ever get like prosecuted for that, because like who cares, but it's still technically speaking, you can't share that stuff around. Now it gets in the weeds because Sasquatch, I guess, is some sort of government contractor himself, which that doesn't necessarily mean anything. That could just mean that could mean he cuts grass on a military base. I don't know what he does.
He works at, I think, a Navy shipyard. It's not like he's not a fed or anything like that.
Yeah, but even then, that gets so in the weeds of how this stuff moves around.
But you never know, and who knows if that was just going to be one component of how he was framing an entire group. Maybe he was doing different things for different people. We don't know. And just because even if it's not technically classified, that doesn't mean that they're not going to go after somebody for conspiracy charges, to conspiring to make HMEs, whatever. Even if, because the FBI in the Whitmer case were sending people, like they sent Frank Butler ingredients to make homemade explosives. They were telling him to use sugar and Drano and stuff like that, like household items. So even, it doesn't matter. They could have been setting these people up for conspiracy charges, for RICO charges with the pooling of funds and things of this nature. And it just sounds so similar to elements of things from the Whitmer case that I just can't believe this is just one of those cases where it happens to be somebody who comes from a family that glows in the dark, for a dad who has done stochastic games and counterterrorism, who worked with his father, who's worked for Booz Allen Hamilton, who's been in the military. I do not believe this individual just did these things willy-nilly, or that he was just trying to look tough, or that he maybe was just a paranoid individual and just wanted to prep, because I have no problem with that. As you guys know, I'm very pro 2A. I support all of these militias that are doing legal trainings. I'm all for the medical, the defensive training. I think that's super important. I think it's important to have people in your community that people you can train with, people that could help you if there's an emergency in your area, because you never know what could happen. But I am not for people like this infiltrating groups and being provocative and weird. And then, of course, having the family that he has. I don't know. It raises many questions. And I also have tried to speak to Duke, and I will put this out there now. I've given his wife my business card. I have tried to talk to her twice. I'm willing to hear Duke's story. If I'm wrong, I will be the first person to admit it. I'd love to hear his side of the story. I would love for him to give me explanations for all of these things. And maybe there are, right? Maybe there are plausible explanations for all of this stuff, and we just haven't heard it yet. And if that's the case, then I invite Duke to speak to us. You've got my contact information. We live in the same town. I'll come meet you for coffee. If you want to have a conversation, we can do so on the record or off the record. I would love to hear any kind of explanation for this. And I'm a very open-minded person. If I get something wrong, I'll be the first person to admit it. But I don't think that Duke is going to be interested in speaking to me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we technically don't know for sure if he was a Fed, at least in the context of this, like he was working for the Feds. We do know he was a Fed, like,
yeah.
But we don't know if he was a Fed in the sense of that he was, as part of his official duties doing this, essentially, or unofficial duties, whatever you want to call it. But at the very least, he glows. He glows like Gandalf on top of the hill, returning with the Rohirrim for Helm's Deep. That's the level of glowing we're dealing with. So I think it's pretty safe to just say Fed. But I don't know. There's some outside chance, and I do encourage Duke to come out and defend himself if he feels like it. I mean, I don't know. I struggle to find a way to explain this, but perhaps there is. But I believe that's like, unless you have something else on this specifically, I'd like to hear kind of what any new updates you have. It's been a while since we talked. I believe there's been probably some appeals, and I think some people may have gone off since last time we talked. I mean, if you just want to quickly run through kind of the what's going on with the Whitmer stuff, and then I guess also kind of what's going on with your documentary.
Yeah, so I think it has been, I believe, have I been on after the last acquittals? I'm not sure if I have. If I haven't, though, so where we currently stand is we have, out of 14, there were 14 defendants, as you guys know. 2 individuals took plea deals very early on. The first person was Ty Garbin, who's always been a questionable individual. Whether he was an informant the whole time or not, I don't know. But that individual had a lawyer who was former FBI. In any case, 2 individuals took plea deals. 4 went to trial. At the first trial, that ended in a complete loss for the government. 2 acquittals, a mistrial on Adam and Barry. They retried Adam and Barry. I know we talked about that. Then after that, they had so they broke up the state charges. There's federal charges. There's state charges. 8 people were charged at the state level. They broke that up into 2 different trials, one in Jackson County for Joe Morrison, Pete Musico, and Paul Bellar. And then the state case in Antrim County was Eric Molitor, Bill and Michael Null, the twins. They're kind of known as like the Null brothers. And then an individual named Sean Fix, who was at the time pretending to be a Navy SEAL when he was friends with Adam Fox. So there are people who will pretend to be operators when they're not. Like Sean Fix told Adam that he could get a Black Hawk helicopter and a Huey and that he had a Connex box filled with gun. Like he just lied about all kinds of stuff. He was never a Navy SEAL. But in any case, Brian Higgins and Sean Fix also took plea deals. They did not testify against anybody else, though. I think the government kind of just wanted to get rid of the case. So Jackson County, the first state trial, those guys all lost. And it was so upsetting for me because I watched people cover the federal trial. And when we got the 2 acquittals, I thought that's a good news. I thought Adam and Barry were going to get off in their retrial. They didn't. When they were convicted, I thought, okay, so people are going to follow this next trial, the Jackson County one. No one reported on it. Nobody. I think I may have been the only person that was sitting there live reporting about what was happening, and it was just as bad as the federal trial. So those men were convicted, and they were charged with providing material support for what? For like something that didn't happen, gang affiliation, and felony firearm, which is just that you had your gun on you while you provided material support. So for Joe Morrison, the material support he provided was his property. He lived at his own house, and that is where the Wolverine Watchman occasionally had meetings and trainings. So apparently that now means he provided material support to the FBI's plot. The last state trial ended in 3 acquittals. The last 3 guys were completely, they were found not guilty. So we're 5 and 5 now. We're about half. 5 have been convicted. 5 have been found innocent. So where we stand with appeals, Adam and Barry have appealed their convictions because they were federal. Their appeals go to the 6th Circuit. Their initial briefings were held before the 6th Circuit a few months back. Now, those arguments went well. The 3-judge panel actually took the additional step, and they don't always do this, of requesting more information. So it's supplemental briefings about specifically the question of if the out-of-court statements, this is the thing I always keep here, these are all of the exculpatory statements. If this stuff would have been presented to the jury, would that have substantially changed the outcome of the case? We all know it would have, because it was a mistrial on Adam and Barry. Clearly, if they would have seen that, those men would have been off. And so we're waiting now. Those supplemental briefings have been done. Both sides made their arguments. Now we're just waiting for the 3-judge panel to make their decision. I believe they're waiting. I think it's political. I think they're going to wait until after the election. I don't think we're going to get an answer anytime soon. They say it could be a few months for the 6th Circuit to make its decision. So I suspect we're not going to get any movement until after the election. But what I actually think is going to happen is I think they're going to grant them their appeals. I believe they've met all the legal merits for why they deserve an appeal. And I believe they are going to get a new trial. So if that happens, that can also positively affect the appeals for the state guys, because you cannot provide, if they get a new trial and they get off, you can't have these men convicted of providing material support for something that didn't happen. And for the state guys, their appeals have been a nightmare. I know it's been a while since I've been on here. I don't think people understand what's happened with them. The state guys they're not charged at the federal level, so they should be in state prison facilities, which is where they were. They were in the MDOC. On the eve of their appeals, they were sent to federal BOP facilities across the country. They sent Joe to Pekin, Illinois. They sent Pete Musico to FCI Gilmer in West Virginia, and they sent Paul to FCI Schuylkill, which is in Minersville, Pennsylvania. So they shipped them all out of Michigan, so they had no access to a Michigan law library. They couldn't meet with their lawyers. Their lawyers couldn't get phone calls with them. When they did get a phone call, and this is in court filings, they said these calls were being monitored by a third party, which we know is the FBI. And these are supposed to be privileged attorney-client phone calls. Then they brought them back. So 10 months, 10 months have gone by where their appeals have just been stagnant because they haven't been in contact with their lawyers. They finally brought them back to Michigan, to Jackson County. And we have emails now where we know that the state, the Attorney General's office basically wanted them moved. And it's purely for political reasons, like to tamper in their appeals to make it as difficult as possible. They said in emails, because of what these guys did to our governor, our boss. Whitmer is actually the head of the MDOC. Technically, she is their boss, and the individual who signed off on the transfer orders, she is only 3 steps removed from Whitmer in the chain of command. So this is Whitmer's underling who's doing her bidding, transferring these men, delaying their appeals. Now it's been 10 months. Now they haven't had time to prepare. They haven't been able to read their transcripts or work with their lawyers or do anything. So now they're in Jackson County and they have just started to be allowed to work with their lawyers. So from what I understand, it's a very convoluted appeals process in Michigan. Eventually it's going to be heard by the Michigan Supreme Court, I would imagine, because I don't believe any Michigan court is going to stand up for these men against the governor of their state, who is like their boss. I don't know how these guys could have fair trials or fair appeals in this process. And right now, they're still in front of Judge Wilson, who was the trial judge, and they're expanding the record. So these men weren't allowed to present a defense. They weren't allowed to raise entrapment. In Michigan, the judge, because of Michigan law, for whatever reason, and this is not the case for federal, the judge is allowed to decide if the defense is allowed to use entrapment or not. And so, of course, the judge said no. So if you've been entrapped, but you're not allowed to use entrapment as a legal defense, how are you having a fair, how is this a fair process? It's nuts.
Fucked.
Yeah, you're screwed. So for those last guys, I mean, they didn't even argue that they were entrapped. They basically argued more of framing of the FBI manipulated the situation, and how they had to dance around it was just by not arguing that the informants entrapped them, just that they were there and they tricked them into getting into a vehicle under false pretenses, right? Which is what they did. So they had to, they wanted to be able to say the informant Dan, informant Steve, and they had to dance around these stupid roles to be able to get that information in and hope that the jury puts together that hey, there's a lot of feds here, and why is the FBI driving the vehicle and this and that? And they actually said at one point when the defense lawyer was trying to mention how Dan was training the group. He was the leader of the Wolverine Watchmen. He led the trainings. That's a fact in evidence. After he gave his statement, when the jury was out of the room, the judge told him, you're not allowed to say that. You can't mention that again. And he's like, but that's just a fact. I'm not arguing entrapment. And he says, yeah, but you're saying he led the group. That's entrapment. I'm like, wait a second. So he can't say a fact in evidence because it alludes to entrapment, and you have decided he can't use entrapment as a defense. So now a jury can't hear the facts of Dan Chappell leading the training and being the leader of a group because, if he's the leader, well, that's entrapment. And you're just going, what? Mm-hmm. It's
the judge is arguing against himself. Logically speaking, you're contradicting yourself. Yeah.
Sir.
Yeah. Yeah, you can't say you can't use entrapment, and then a fact is presented and then you say that means it's entrapment, and you can't say that, and you're like, well,
But you're
then
like,
you need to change some things. I don't know what to tell you.
it's
So,
yeah, so that's where we are, like with their cases. And as far as the documentary goes, it's a lot of stuff. We're still working on it, but we have the second trailer that is going to be released very soon. I want to say in the next 2 weeks. I'm horrible with giving time estimates. It's always more than that because we're perfectionists here, you know. But I think that people are going to find that very, very exciting. It's a lot better quality than the first trailer. I'll say that, which I'm still proud of, though. Don't get me
yeah.
wrong. So
Well, I'm
hopefully
looking.
very soon here.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to it. I did want to mention one little thing, one little factoid. It doesn't really mean much in this Duke thing, the whole Kekoa story. The judge presiding over the case is also the same judge that ruled over the Chelsea Manning thing, and I guess
Yeah.
typically that judge handles intel related type stuff. So
Yeah, that's
you
the
know,
NatSec building and judge. You
yeah,
can't even bring a cell phone into the building. You have to leave your phone in the car, unlike other courthouses. Yeah, he was also going to, I believe, be presiding over the Julian Assange, but they ended up not extraditing him and giving him, the plea deal. But yeah, Tranga,
yeah,
he's an interesting character, that's for
yeah.
sure.
Yeah, I was just mentioning just the very fact they chose him kind of implies the Intel connection because that seems to be his beat where he always seems to. I mean, I don't know how they go about choosing judges, but I don't know. I mean, that seems to be his beat. So,
Well,
but with that,
yeah,
go
in
ahead.
that courthouse, the Alexandria courthouse, where they're at in the Eastern District of Virginia, that's the national security like courthouse. That's where all of the national security stuff goes. They could have had him in Fairfax County. He lives where I live, so he could have just been at the Fairfax County courthouse. The fact that he's not and that they put him in the national security one is also very telling because he's not like he should be at the Fairfax County one, you would think, if this was going by where he lived, and if the crime, was at his house where he was manufacturing the rice. And I just find, the whole thing is very suspicious. That is the theme to take away from tonight's show. Sus.
Yep, very much so. But with that, Christina, let people know where they can find you at, and we'll go ahead and get out of here.
I'm on Twitter at NotRadix, and the website for the documentary for the Whitmer case is kandkfilm.com.
Yeah. Well, appreciate you coming on. For those who want to support me or follow me on Twitter at TowerGangJose. If you want to support me monetarily, you can do that at patreon.com. Just NoWayJose2020. Lowest level's $2. I'll give you early access to these episodes. So you can show up for the streams just like my good buddy JC here. Good to see Radix again. Because this is behind the paywall right now. This gets released roughly about a week later. I also do my Already Dead episodes, which is a live stream, but we do call-in feature. And if you're a patron of me or my co-host, we'll bring you can come on as a talking head on the show, in the call-in portion of the show. I also want to give a shout out to my sponsors. This is my highest level of my Patreon. I read them off every episode. And my co-hosts on Tower Gang, at Tower Gang Toad. I have also at Abrogate D's, at ZOVERACK, at _Infinite Zeal. Jacob Daniel of the Biblical Anarchy podcast. Follow him at Biblical Anarchy. Go check out his podcast as well. I've been on there multiple times. Tim Tuttle at Jolly on Klebold. He makes a lot of edits for, just that I use for the show. Big buddy of mine. I actually intended on using one of his for this, but then I screwed up, technologically speaking. And then I also have Will Bell. He makes this delicious blueberry wine. Rabbit Eye is what it's called. Go get it online. You can get there. I think he sells it in most states. But with that, we are out of here. Like, share, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. Bye-bye.